Nick Rekieta of Rekieta Law. And so, as I mentioned, he is a lawyer and a YouTuber. He's somebody who's got a very nice channel over at Rekieta Law. And so the link to his channel is in our description. And I'm going to bring him on right now. There he is. We got Mr. Rekieta himself. What's up, Nick? How are you, my friend?
Hey, man. Good. Thanks for having me on.
It's good to see you. You know, it's funny. It's one of these things. I've been watching you for a long time, and we sort of are in some of the same lawyerly legal circles. And I don't know much about you, so that was kind of where I wanted to start. I mean, it's like I've watched your commentary, your topics. So I know sort of you incidentally, but I want to really kind of get into the origin story because lawyers have this kind of journey that we go through, and then make it onto YouTube, and then some of us don't make it, we go different directions. And so I would love to kind of start there, if you don't mind. Kind of give us a background on first of all maybe the origin story as a lawyer, but then also as somebody who is now doing commentary and somebody who's sort of in the media.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to do so. Let's see. My origin story as a lawyer is one that I think is non-traditional, but not that uncommon. I graduated from undergrad in 2005 with a degree in literature and creative writing, which is a degree in nothing. It's absolutely worthless as far as getting a job and making money. So I quickly moved into a field that was viable for supporting a family. I was already married at the time. And I went into banking because I had worked in banking for temporary jobs and stuff like that during school. And it seemed like a good place to be. So I worked at several different banks and then eventually ended up at Thrivent Financial, where I stayed for a couple of years. And then my wife and I, with our growing family, decided to move out into the middle of nowhere. We were in the suburbs of Minneapolis, and then we moved about 2 hours west of the Twin Cities into the country where I have never lived. We got rid of all the good stuff about the cities, like food and shopping. But we traded that for stars and quiet.
Yeah.
So
and you said outside of Minneapolis, right? So I mean, you were just kind of that's kind of a good move given the last year or so.
Yeah, it's been a disaster in Minneapolis lately. I've been there a couple times since everything started, and even when things are quiet, it feels weird. It feels very, very different from when I lived there. And to be clear, I was on the far south suburbs of Minneapolis, so I wasn't really in the city itself, but I worked downtown. And so, you'd have to go in every day into downtown. But when we moved out, I was telecommuting for a while. And then Thrivent was about to get a nice annual audit from the SEC. And they said, hey, you have a lot of personal information at your house. And I was like, well, yeah, I work from home. And they said, we want you to work back at the office again. And I said, I'm not driving 2 hours every day to work. So peace, right? I'll find something else to do. Well, it turns out when all of your experience is in like back office operations and stuff like that, that working in a small town gets really difficult if you don't want to do retail banking or retail sales or something like that, which I didn't want to do. So I said, where you can work anywhere in the world, that's being a lawyer. You'll be universally reviled, but you'll be universally employable. So I went to law school. I went to William Mitchell College of Law in St. Paul, and which is now Mitchell Hamlin, which is also why they don't get any checks from me as an alumni, because the school I went to is dead. So I went there, had a good time, learned, got my legal education, passed the bar, and then set out. I opened my own firm. I did private. I still do, I guess. I still have a case. Private criminal defense, and as well as some contract and transactional stuff to go along with that, and entity formation. The boring stuff that pays the bills, and then small town criminal defense, which was kind of fun, but doesn't pay very well out here. There's just not enough people are shooting each other. So we don't have a lot of big cases.
You got to go back into Minneapolis.
Right. Yeah.
For that.
No, thanks. No, thanks. But so I was doing that for a while. And then I actually transitioned into doing YouTube when I covered a lawsuit in a podcast that I watched. It was the Biggest Problem in the Universe podcast, which is great. Two co-hosts, one of them sued the other one for somewhere between $20 and $400 million the complaint was so poorly written, it was hard to determine what the actual amount was. And I said, you know what? I'm going to drink a bunch of whiskey and I'm going to read through this lawsuit and explain to people what's going on. And then people liked it. So now that's what I do.
Yeah, and it's great. And I mean, you sort of have a kind of a broad range, which is why I was asking about it, because you do talk about some civil stuff. Like I was just on your channel, I was looking at that. I think it was the lawsuit between H3 and Thriller.
Mhm.
And I was looking and I was like, I've never heard of these people, because I sort of, keep to a tight criminal law, beat up the government kind of every day. And so you also have some civil experience, or I was kind of trying to flesh out maybe some of the stuff that you cover on your channel, what your focus is.
I do. I mean, I have some civil experience in my personal practice. I try to stay away from it for the most part. I try to stay away from practicing law because I much prefer going on YouTube and talking and having fun. But I do have some civil experience, but I try to cover anything that I can reasonably translate from legal speak into normal people talk. And I think that's a tool that a lot of people could use, especially when you look at commentary coming out of CNN or any of the mainstream, even Fox. It doesn't matter. They all get the same thing. You get these very truncated and biased views on what's going on in a legal situation, and not a lot of translation into how normal people think, act, and speak. So that's what I try and cover, is just anywhere I can maybe add some clarification and then, throw in a few opinions here and there along the way.
Yeah, and you do a great job of it. And I think that probably a lot of our audiences kind of overlap a little bit. A lot of people have told me, hey, get Rekieta on, and vice versa, or told me to go, on your channel, whatever, to connect, because I think that a lot of the same value you provide is it's a lot of the same things we're doing, which is really going deep. And I think, unfortunately, too often these days it is those, they take a sentence out or a paragraph out, and they summarize the entire claim, and there's really just not a lot of truth there. And so, by going deep, I think you are providing some value that is just missing elsewhere, which is unfortunate. I wanted to ask a little bit about your political perspectives on this, or sort
Sure.
of, I don't want to paint with sort of a broad stroke here, but where do you sort of fall, or I know it's a broad question, but the reason I ask this is because
Right.
there's kind of a handful of lawyers out there who sort of emerge from the pack. To me, it feels like a very uniform industry where a lot of lawyers just kind of are lockstep with other lawyers. And I think this is a really big problem. And, and maybe we can get into some of this about, well, not really the election or any of the, COVID stuff or anything like that, because we can't really talk about it.
Away.
But my point is there's sort of a uniformity with a lot of lawyers these days. And then there's a handful of other people that kind of break free from the mold. And I'm just trying to kind of understand how that process worked for you.
Yeah. Well, I start with the premise of I hate lawyers by default. And I think a lot of lawyers who do what you're talking about they get into that sort of space because you while you're practicing, you run into bad actors, or you run into I won't put words in your mouth, but in my case for criminal defense, you run into those bad actors and their prosecutors or the state a lot of times. And you start to see what's going on out there. And you start to realize like the incentive for lawyers to act in a particular way that might be ethical by the rules, but for personal ethics, you kind of wonder about what's going, like how these people sleep at night. Right. And so that's kind of the genesis of my stepping away from where other lawyers are a lot of the times. But political leanings, I mean, I've been libertarian right forever. I think I have very, very strong opinions on how things should be in my own personal life, but I don't want to impose those on other people. And I'm not so sure the government should be doing that in the majority of cases. And so when you combine sort of that libertarian right ideal with this sort of premise that a lot of the lawyers end up being kind of scummy when you run into them, and you combine that part with a lot of lawyers that you run into, probably the overwhelming majority being at least center left at best. I just get kind of I run into some friction, I guess, with how other lawyers' opinions shake out on a lot of topics.
That's kind of where I was going with that. I mean, I know my question was inartful, but it was sort of, how did you kind of break free from the mold? Because I had the same experience. I went to law school, I did go to the bar functions and the CLEs and everything like that. And, of course, lawyers are advocates. We're political like anybody. But as soon as those things come out, I always kind of felt myself being the odd one out, kind of, this is weird. Why are all these people talking about, confiscatory taxes? Like, this is the best thing that I've ever heard of. This is insane. And so, when I started, my channel, my experience with here on YouTube, sort of, maturing into what we do now, was very slow. It was very just kind of, coming out of my shell, very slow motion. And I got a lot of pushback. I mean, I still do from colleagues, from people who, I went to law school with, or who are in our community, other defense lawyers and whatever, who just kind of, hey, Rob, we're, it's that concern trolling. We're just a little, concerned about what you're saying out there. And, to me, it just feels like the antithesis of what we're supposed to be doing as lawyers. We're supposed to be out there advocating. We're supposed to be moving for social change. And, a guy like you, you've been doing it for some period of time and you've been successful at it. Does it frustrate you maybe that you don't see more other lawyers out there doing the same thing? Or you kind of, what's your take on the whole legal situation?
Well, the interesting thing is, you got pushback. I never really did from my colleagues, and that might have something to do with, people not caring about me. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. No, actually, most of my, friends from law school are, I shouldn't say they have similar political views as I do. Some of them do, but the other ones are just kind of ambivalent about that whole aspect of it. And they know that we'll disagree about a political position, but it really just doesn't matter. It kind of feels like living in the 90s again. It's like, oh, well, I don't agree with you on that. Cool, let's go grab food. And so I never got pushback. What I got a lot from my classmates was, like, how do you have time to do all this? How are you covering these topics that are in such different practice areas? How are you, how are you able to do that? And it was like, well, I don't know. I just like to. What was kind of the answer there. As for frustration with them, with people not being as much of a voice of change, most lawyers, I don't want to be a voice of social change. Actually, most lawyers, I find their views to be troubling. And so, and I also think that, talking about bar functions and CLEs, we can kind of easily congregate into ivory towers and cast down thoughts from on high. And so I don't want a lot of lawyers doing that. The lockstep sort of approach that you're talking about, I see it all the time. And I see it most on law Twitter, which is a collection of people that I intimately and vehemently despise. Because you can see the groupthink manifest in real time around these very, very important and nuanced subjects. And one of the things you mentioned earlier was about going deep into this stuff. And when you start going deep into constitutional issues or Supreme Court cases, you find out that their rulings are almost intensely narrow, but yet they're extrapolated out into the public as if they're these broad things. And that's, law Twitter is not immune from that. They make sweeping generalizations about some of these legal topics and legal cases, and they ignore the nuance in the room. And so I don't want a lot of them out there advocating. And I think, as a society, we don't want a lot of lawyers advocating as much as we want them literally just working. Because the ones who are good, who are working on behalf of their clients, and that is the lawyer ethic that we want. We want lawyers to represent their clients and to do it vehemently. I want them doing that. And I want the ones who are really good at that doing that as much as possible. I don't really want them commenting on society, because that ethic of I need to represent whoever's walking through my door does not comport with the ethic of teaching society how it should be, in my opinion.
And, I understand where you're going with that. And I think, maybe I would draw the delineation there sort of between maybe commercial practice of law, like I'm a DUI lawyer. Somebody needs help with a DUI. They call me. I don't give them a political spiel. I don't give them the advocacy thing other than criminal justice reform is important, right. Reasonable doubt, presumption of innocence, all that stuff. And that's about the extent of it. The reason why I talk about, legal advocacy and, more lawyers speaking up is because I've got a real concern here that, it's becoming very one-sided. And like you, I'm somebody who's on, center right-ish. I really have a lot of disdain for bureaucracy and for people telling me that they know better than I do. And
Mhm.
I want to fight against that. That's sort of the passion behind my firm and why we do what we do. But when we were covering a lot of the 2020 election stuff, and we're even seeing some fallout of it today with all of the audits taking place all around the country, there's a war going on in the courts, and there are sort of the politicization of certain efforts that are almost being weaponized in the courts. And we saw this a lot. I think, Mark Elias, democracy docket. We saw all of the preceding litigation before November 3rd even happened. And there's this sort of coalition of lawyers on the left, and even the ACLU, something that has been sort of tried and true about free speech and civil rights. They're sort of picking and choosing their battles now. And so you've got all of these lawyers on the one side that have unlimited money funded by, the Zuckerbergs and the Bezos and all of these people putting together these really powerful organizations. And to me, it feels like, guys like you and I and, Barnes and Viva and like some of those guys, there is, that sort of contingent of people who are on YouTube sort of, screaming from the rooftops. There's also the contingency of, some of the Federalist people and some of the old school conservative networks. But are they doing much of anything? I mean, I'm not really seeing much. And so some of this apathy makes me just, a little bit concerned, which is why, why I was asking you about it. Because if people, like you who are not center right aren't speaking, there's a consequence to that too.
Oh, it's a big consequence. And I briefly want to mention that in the wake of all the election stuff, there's only one major election lawyer that I'm aware of that actually received sanctions from any court in regards to their election litigation. And that's Mark Elias.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's the funniest part of all of it. But
I didn't know that, but yeah, but I mean, but that guy he's a very powerful force. And I feel like a lot of people are sort of overlooking the power that guy had and the influence that he had. And, even amongst lawyers, it's just kind of like the forgotten topic right now.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you were saying with when one side doesn't speak up, it becomes apparent. And I think there's one that's insanely true. And it's we've been feeling the effects of one side not speaking up in the same way for the past several decades. And we're really culminating into what that amounts to. And that is the right has backed down from public advocacy, not just legal public advocacy, but all of it. They've backed down and capitulated on so many issues to the progressive sort of left narrative that we're now feeling the effects of it. And the effect of it is one that compounds into, I think, lawyers that have more of a perspective that we have are afraid to come out and talk because you will be ostracized from legal society. Like I deal with law Twitter. I have a couple hangers on from law Twitter who will come and comment on almost every tweet that I make, despite even when I'm not talking about any issue they've ever interacted with me on, they just do. And it's part of this sort of culture that's built up where they are the predominant view, they're insulated in that view, and anything else must be punished. And so you see that you're ostracized from social events, and I think that's the place. So we're left with guys, prior to the YouTube law community really starting to grow, we're left with guys like Ben Shapiro and I guess to some extent Mike Cernovich or something like that. And they have their own idiosyncrasies that can be out there, but the main thing is they were cultivating very specific audiences for them, and it doesn't really translate into the broad kind of advocacy that we want to see right versus left to kind of balance that equation out. And I think that's what's nice about YouTube and starting to see so many law channels, and especially coming from the center right type of position, that we're starting to get some pushback.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where the firepower is. Yes, Shapiro and Cernovich and Crowder suing somebody, and Veritas, I think, is also suing New York Times and the Twitters and all of, like, that's all great. Those are great. Those are media people, and they're attorneys also. And I'm not trying to downplay anything that they're doing. I mean, I think all of those people are integral in a movement. They are the public facing public persona. They need to help raise some emotion and some energy behind the movement. But the conservatives or libertarians or Republicans or whatever, the opposition, they got to also have some heavyweights in court. The Democracy Docket, Mark Elias people, I read their briefs. Okay. I read their briefs. I read the other side's briefs when we were going through all of that stuff. One is good. One is not so good. And, if there's going to be a real war for America, they cannot forget that battlefield, in my opinion.
I agree. And I talked to one of the lawyers who did a lawsuit up in Michigan, and this one kind of flew under the radar because it settled out. But basically, Detroit election worker training involved specific advice on how to use COVID to keep election watchers, the poll watchers, from being able to observe what was going on. They said, well, they can't be 6 feet behind you, so set up your tables within 6 feet of the wall. That was the actual advice they were given. It was recorded by a friend of mine. He was at the training, and we talked about it on the show. And then a lawyer up in Michigan ended up taking that case on behalf of the GOP, but there were no lawyers other than that in Michigan going after anything. And the GOP, and this I think is going to indicate why we saw such poor work coming out of the right. They had no legal plan going into that election. Yeah. And the way they talked and the amount of fundraising that they did and the way they talked about how they were worried about the election and everything, you would think that they would have had in all 50 states firms on retainer with lawsuits ready to go, or at least in the 4 major swing states that ended up deciding it. And you find out that no, they had no ground infrastructure of legal teams in place to challenge any of this. It's not that I think there's a narrative out there that they had something in place and then those guys walked out and then they hired new people. No, they hired those first guys in the middle of it, and then they walked out and then they hired new people. There was no prep for it. They did not have everything ready to go. Whereas you could see with Mark Elias and Democracy Docket, they had infrastructure. They had a website ready for their marketing. I mean, that is the Democracy Docket. Yep. And they had the legal teams were already drafting complaints before the first votes had been cast. They knew exactly what they were doing. They adapted them very quickly to facts on the ground. And I mean, heck, Mark Elias was going after Texas for stuff long before any votes even came in.
Yeah, but, we were covering a litigation back in, during the summer, I think, even before that, I think even in March and stuff, some of these the initial complaints and injunctions and all this stuff were being filed like in March. It was a full frontal assault, and it was very obvious that the GOP was caught flat-footed. And I couldn't tell whether it was, sort of intentional, like they just wanted to, Trump's up in there, so we're not going to support him because he's not our guy. And that there was sort of this disconnect or decoupling where the GOP resources, the Federalist people and sort of, the traditional McConnell crew, they weren't going to lend any of their resources or support to sort of flesh out and lay down a foundation for victory.
Yeah, I think I think that's part of it. And then I think the other part is, a bunch of lawyers made a reasonable determination that if they participated in the knife fight on the political level, on the political national level, that their firms would be in jeopardy. And it's real easy for anybody who doesn't have a bunch of people that they, feed the families of to say, well, you should have fought that fight. But it's like, okay, I have 9 staff that I got to make sure they are eating in Christmas time and it's November. If I enter into this fight, I might not, it might kill the firm. And we've seen the efforts that they've put into going after not just the Sidney Powells and Lynn Woods of the world, but they're going after anybody who represented Trump in any way. And a lot of them have gone radio silent in the post-election stuff. But heck, I mean, they went after Vanderveen pretty heavily, the guy who ended up running the bulk of Trump's his impeachment defense. And they have no problem going after and burying a law firm, because there's 10 more law firms where that one came from.
Yeah, and I remember seeing this. I remember seeing the motions to withdraw being filed by attorneys, and there was a lot of even news story. The media was sort of, cackling about it. Trump can't find any law firms. And it's like, hey, guys, this is not a good thing. The fact that we've got lawyers here who's kind of sworn an oath, to go out there and represent a client, no matter what they think of the person, right? Everybody deserves that defense and that representation. And for, a bunch of attorneys to just say, well, I'm kind of a little bit too scared on this one, and that our media and that other lawyers were sort of applauding them, left me sort of, disappointed in our profession, because I think that, the country could have been well served by fleshing out some of those issues in court, because I still have questions about, separation of powers, and about whether a court can unilaterally modify the legislature's, setting of the election date. Those are important issues,
right,
that maybe we want to understand, learn more about.
And Pennsylvania is still the most amazing one to me, because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court basically ruled that the legislator violating the Pennsylvania Constitution was just fine. And the Supreme Court of the United States didn't even step in to say, maybe we want to just find out if the state Supreme Court can determine that a willful violation of the state constitution is okay when it implicates a federal election. That's a really important question, because if you have a state constitution, which is supposed to be all your rules, and then the state Supreme Court can just say, and the federal government has no say in how that impacts the governance of the country, I think that might be a problem, but we'll never know what the Supreme Court thinks about it, because they balked on the case. They just, no, we're not going to hear it. Because they were too afraid at the implications of what would happen. And the crazy thing is, I said from the get-go, I didn't think any court was going to overturn any of the results, but I think they still feared what would happen if people thought maybe they should have overturned them and didn't. Like, well, you ruled that this wasn't acceptable, but you're going to allow it to stand. I think that was a conflict that the Supreme Court wasn't willing to take on. And it's, what you said about, seeing people praising the courts for not doing what they're supposed to do. That has been one of the weirdest takes in this whole thing. It's like, well, no, I want the court to engage these issues. I don't care if they are going to overturn it or not. We have another election in 2 years.
Right.
we need to suss this out.
Right. It's an important question. I mean, it's a really important question. And it's exactly the reason why the Supreme Court is set up to tell us, when we've got two conflicting interpretations of how the country should run, we need you to step in. That's why we have three branches. So it's not an even number, so that we can,
right.
like they thought this through, folks, but they didn't even give us the opportunity to have it heard in front of the Supreme Court, which is a bummer. I wanted to transition a little bit, just because you are in Minnesota and you're outside of Minneapolis. I wanted to talk Chauvin just a little bit before we get out of here. And really, I wanted to sort of get your perspective on this. I'm in Arizona. Most people are not in Minnesota. Most people are not 2 hours outside of Minneapolis. And so we had our perception of how this whole trial unfolded, right? It was national news here in Arizona, but I'm sure to a different extent than it was in Minnesota. And so I just wanted to maybe get your take on sort of the, boots on the ground there over the last year or so. What was happening, from an everyday citizen, because we're all trying to, ask and answer the question, was this a fair and impartial trial? And one of the big things that has been, at the forefront of everybody's mind is, no, it's been bedlam. It's been madness in Minneapolis for the better part of a year. You've got jurors coming and going. How could it possibly be fair and impartial? But, I just kind of, I'm not asking you for an answer on that determination, unless you want to provide one, but just kind of, what is the sense of the environment?
The fair and impartial question, to get this out of the way, no, I don't think he got a fair trial. It doesn't mean I think he's not guilty, but I think I can easily say, that's a much more complicated question, but I can say with confidence, I don't think he got a fair trial. I don't think there was any way he was going to get one in Minneapolis. The question with whether, with how the courts are supposed to handle that's the weird problem, because where could someone like Chauvin get a fair trial in the United States even right now? That's a tough question. But I think they would have been served moving it out to St. Cloud, down to Rochester, Mankato, out to the Wilmer Courthouse where I am, Benson, any smaller town than Minneapolis would have mitigated the risk to jurors, would have mitigated the amount of intimidation that could be put on. Because the farther you get outside of the Twin Cities, the more expensive it is to have a mass protest somewhere. The last mass protest in my area, which is the Wilmer area, had literally 20 people. And that was it was a Black Lives Matter protest, and it's 20 people standing on a bridge with signs, and that's it. There's no buildings burned down or any crazy stuff. So I think they would have been better served anywhere other than Minneapolis or the metro area. But they so far have not determined that. With that being said, I mean, Minnesota has been a very, very different place for the past year.
Yeah.
We saw it start with Floyd. The protests were big. They were news. And then I think that itself spawns a more visceral response to everything. There was a guy who shot himself on camera, and the narrative went out right away that it was police that shot him. There were police there. He pulled the gun, puts it up to his head and shoots himself. And the narrative was that he was shot by police, and that sparked about a day of protests before that actually sorted itself out. And people started to go, yeah, there's video. It was him. It's pretty clear. But that sort of reaction was not something I think Minneapolis has been used to. I've lived here. Well, I lived in Minneapolis for about 20 years. And then I've lived out in the country about 12 years now. And so in all of my time in Minnesota, I've not seen anything like that in any response to the sort of political demonstration. So seeing that, and then I have a bunch of friends who live in Minneapolis, and seeing like their responses to what's going on. You've got that the riots, of course, combining with COVID, and you've got the city of Minneapolis telling people, if you're getting held up for your cell phone and your wallet, just give it over. Just hand it over to the people. Don't make a stink about it. If your car is being jacked, just give them the keys. Just give them your stuff. Don't resist. Just go home. Because basically telling them, cops aren't coming to save you now. You have to do it later. So I think that feeds into just in a general intimidation that could happen for any jurors. But I don't know that these jurors were intimidated. I think many of them felt empowered to be on that jury. And that is a different type of unfairness that is equally dangerous.
Yeah, we saw that with with Brandon Mitchell, which is the juror number 52, which we've talked about a lot on our channel. I'm sure you have also. This guy goes in and is basically kind of hinting at the idea that he wanted to sort of elbow his way onto the jury in order to effectuate some social change. And I understand, I understand that he may think that's a valid legal strategy, and that, there are a lot of people who are probably cheering him on, but I've got a lot of issues with that, because I think it is a catastrophic sort of cascade of consequences that will then spiral out of control. You're going to see it going both directions. You're going to see other people of other colors getting onto juries and then trying to weaponize the jury panel against any particular defendant. And once that starts, I mean, you sort of lose the legitimacy in the entire institution.
Right. And with Brandon Mitchell, one thing that if people don't understand how juries work, typically you have 2, maybe 3 strong personalities on any 12-person jury. And those strong personalities at the end of the day are going to win the arguments in the jury room. And unless you have 2 people who have equally strong personalities diametrically opposed, you're not going to get a hung jury. Someone will eventually cave in after 20, 30, 40 hours of deliberation. So when someone like Brandon Mitchell, who wants to effectuate the change that he wants to see in the world through the jury process, gets in on that jury, he will be one of the most adamant people in that jury room. He's got a mission, he's got a motive, and that means that there was apparently one holdout when they first went in, at least as to one of the charges, and that guy's voice is going to get drowned out by the more aggressive and assertive people. And so if you're sending in agendized people, imagine if you took a bunch of me's and put them in jury rooms, and I'm going to be like, jury nullification on just about any drug charge, right? You're never going to get you're never going to land a drug charge again with me on a jury. It won't happen. I'll laugh. I'll do it just to ruin the prosecutor's day. I don't care. So the same thing goes with someone who's marching at a Black Lives Matter event that they traveled 1,800 miles to get to or something. No.
Yep.
However far it is from Minneapolis to Washington, wearing a shirt that says "Take your knees off our necks." Like, if he wants to do all that advocacy, great. That's his thing. The jury room is the improper place for it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm wondering, sort of to wrap things up, what is has the tone changed in Minnesota at all? Are we coming down on the tension meter? And what's happening there? Because the last I heard, they were defunding the police with like 8 million gone, then they gave 6 million of it back, and it's kind of been this, this roller coaster. And so what's sort of the environment like now?
Well, Minneapolis is becoming an island to itself in regards to police power. They do not have the support of surrounding departments. They do not have the support of departments outside of the Twin Cities. When the riot started, even towns by me were sending officers in to help with the riots. They would, relieve officers in the cities who'd been working and on those front lines. They don't do it anymore. And they're not going to. When the stuff happened in Brooklyn Center is pretty much, it's them in Minneapolis who's getting their officers. They don't want to send officers in because Minneapolis did not have the backs of their own officers. And more importantly, less regards to the 4 officers charged in Floyd's death, and more in regards of the officers who were ordered to abandon precinct number 3 in Minneapolis and let the mob burn it down. That is, wait, you're going to ask us to come in and clean up the mess that you won't even fight for. So smaller, like, surrounding communities are not really favorable to what's been going on in Minneapolis police. As for the overall tension, I think right now, I think a bunch of people have gotten used to the social element of protest. And I don't think this is limited to Minneapolis. I think it's all across every metro area. We saw this. You took away everything with COVID, everybody's social interactions, and then you told them this one activity is just fine for you. And so when you watch videos of these protests and stuff like that, you'll see people out there selling shirts. You'll see them out there with a food truck or a food stand. You'll see people playing music. You'll see dancing, and you'll see all this stuff going on. It's like, well, this is a social endeavor. And if you talk to people who lived through the Vietnam protests and stuff like that, it was the same thing. I know people who protested Vietnam and protested the draft because it was the cool thing to do. That's where the chicks were. And so they actually did that. And I think we're seeing it now. So I don't think the tension overall is going to drop until it becomes socially unpopular to have a massive protest. But with that said, I think the entire, I want to be clear on this. I think the entire thing is a missed opportunity, because I remember the day when Floyd died and that video went around, and just about everybody I talked to was ready to have a discussion about police use of force and police violence. The next day, the riot started and the right shut it off. And it was like, but there's still a valuable discussion here. And that's why at the beginning of this, I said, as for whether Chauvin is guilty or innocent, at some point we did have a state official kneeling on a citizen until they died. And that is an opportunity for discussion about this. It's not an opportunity for riots. It may not mean that Derek Chauvin is guilty or not, but if he's not guilty, we have to ask how comfortable we are with that type of scenario. And that's the discussion I wanted to have and don't get to anymore because of how the rioting played out. And that's frustrating.
I totally agree. And I've been screaming about this. I thought that the whole country was aligned after we all saw that video. We all sat down and said, okay, you know what? Maybe we really do need to have a conversation about policing in America. Maybe it's time to have that conversation. And somebody who is, more right, but I also am a criminal defense attorney. So I have this weird overlap where, I don't like big authoritarian government. That includes police, that includes law enforcement, that includes the FBI and, county attorneys all over the place. And I try to be consistent in that. And so finally, as a criminal defense lawyer, I've been building a law firm, so excited about this justice reform. We're going to talk about it finally. And then suddenly they start burning down the whole city. And I'm like, oh, great. Right. So we have that. Then the next conversation is, well, we're just going to defund the police. And I'm going, folks, the pendulum is going back the other direction so far out that even I, as a defense lawyer, I got to abandon ship. Right. I don't support any of that stuff.
Yeah. As much as I don't want police I don't want a cop to have to shoot anybody. Right. And there are times when they absolutely have to shoot someone, right? Like, I'm with it, but I don't want them to ever have to do that. And so if we can have that as the ideal and then move policing in that way, that's a good thing. And then the second those riots started, it's like, and you just killed it. Right. You just ended our chance to discuss this. It's now political and will be the most political thing, as it turns out, for the next year. The most politically divisive topic I can imagine is Chauvin and Floyd, to the point where I won't criticize the left on this, but speaking nary an ill word, as if Chauvin had never done anything wrong, is risky on the right now, because you will get hammered with all sorts of comments about how Floyd did X, Y, and Z. And it's like, okay, but can we just for 1 minute focus on this other aspect of it and talk about that? You can't really do it right now. And that's a frustrating outcome of this. It's like, okay, well, I guess I'll have to wait till someone else gets killed, and then we can maybe have that discussion again. But then, we run into the issue of the media not covering those stories. The biggest one, which I'll advocate for all the time, is Daniel Shaver, the guy getting gunned down in the hallway there in Arizona, wasn't it?
Yep. Right here in Mesa. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And Philip Brailsford's the officer who's walked free after murdering that kid.
And got reinstated to the point where he gets a pension now, which is just insane.
Yeah. So quick on that one. What happened was this was the hotel room where this officer is barking orders at Daniel Shaver's young man, who is on his hands and knees following all the instructions in the world that he can possibly do. And they're telling him, stand up, sit down, hands up, hands down, hands behind your back, whatever. He reaches back to sort of lift his pants up as he's crawling on the ground, and this cop just executes him right in the hallway. It was a Mesa Police Department. Mesa, they let him go while this whole thing was pending. Trial happens in Maricopa County. This guy had a "you're effed," sort of ingrained into the side of his assault weapon. And he, basically executed this guy. No question about it. If you watch the video, just not a threat, not a danger, executed him. So Mesa PD dumps him. Trial goes forward. Trial, totally rigged in my opinion, whatever. He gets acquitted, and Mesa temporarily reinstates him so that they could give him his pension for the next, 2,000 years, whatever, and then relieve him again. So, it was such a crooked, corrupt deal. That was one of the first cases that made me want to get on YouTube. It was too early in my career to get on here and start screaming about that stuff. But I'm with you, man. This type of stuff, it is so reprehensible that we got to talk about it.
Yeah, it's and someone says, what was he reaching for? Literally his shorts. He didn't have anything to reach for. And the problem with that situation is you had something like 6 officers, one perpetrator being Shaver, who wasn't really guilty of anything that we know of. And they chose to yell and scream orders at him in a hallway rather than employ any of the 6 officers to have him lay down on the ground with his hands over his head, go and effect some sort of arrest while the other officers covered them. They could have, they did everything wrong in that situation. And
so, I got you off track on that. Sorry. I went off on a tirade because that one gets me so angry, but but you had a point to make. You were saying that was the one that you sort of go back to.
Well, that's one where I say we have potential problems with state violence. And that's where the focus of these discussions should come up. And for me, being kind of libertarian and very much in favor of personal liberty, that question should be asked every time an officer fires their weapon or ends up being involved in the death of a citizen. Whether or not the officer is guilty is actually less important to me than the discussion about why we have a dead person. And similarly, when we have an officer who is on the losing end of one of those struggles and the officer is killed, we should be asking the same questions. Was this law a reasonable law that should be enforced with violence? because at the end of the day, every law ends with a bullet. It's a matter of time until it happens, whether it's loose cigarettes up in New York, selling loose cigarettes ends up with Alton Sterling dead. Or some guy just getting reported for what was that? Oh, that was another one. I think that was in Arizona. Or New Mexico, where a neighbor called on their downstairs neighbors who were playing music, and he's like, he had a noise complaint, and he said, "Oh yeah, it's domestic violence or whatever. We'll get a cop out here fast enough." The guy answered the door at night holding a gun, and the police officer shot him in the back of the head. Yep. And it's like, okay, these are the times we have to ask these questions. But if the media is not going to report on anything except interracial violence between police and the citizenry, and they're going to report on it in one way, we'll never get to have that discussion.
Yeah, that sounds like, sounds like the sort of the beginning of a solution. If I was going to ask you sort of where, how do we start to solve some of these issues? It sounds like maybe that's where you're going, right? Some of these laws that were stopping people that lead to the Dante Wright shooting, or that lead to the George Floyd, or that lead to these things are not necessary anymore. And maybe they're from a bygone era. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah, there are ways where we can deal with these sort of things. I'm not for like a speed trap camera or something like that, but there are certain things that are they came out of the 70s, and this idea of proactive policing, which I'll talk about this till the end of time too, but those were studies that were generated to figure out how to police high crime areas. And because of things like the fear of racial profiling and stuff like that, they got put out just everywhere instead. So now you'll get pulled over for an expired registration. You'll get pulled over for a license plate light out. And that'll be a primary offense that you'll get pulled over because they say, oh, there could be guns or drugs in the car. And so those sort of interactions, we have to start asking, do we want to put our police officers at risk of getting into a violent encounter with a citizen over this thing? Now, if it's drunk driving, maybe because they're dangerous, right? If it's speeding, maybe because it's dangerous. If it's the light on a license plate, I'm not so sure. And so all of these laws need to be reevaluated. But the way that this stuff is covered in the media, and kind of as a final point, I guess, this will be why I'm happy to see so many lawyers popping up on YouTube and being sort of those counter narrative lawyers like you, Robert Barnes, Viva Fry, all of these guys, is that we are on the edge of where communication and media distribution is going. And those CNN analysts and stuff like that, they're going to fall by the wayside for the mainstream public eventually. We're ahead of them in that game. And that's what's encouraging to me, is we can start having these conversations in these places, and we'll be ahead of where society will eventually end up.
Right. And I agree. And, I think there's a reason for that, because we've already talked about this. There's some depth there. There's some analysis that's taking place, and you get to have a real connection with the person who's behind the camera. You can sort of see it in their face when they're disgusted by what they read, or when they're irritated or whatever. Different than what you get with the Anderson Coopers who just read from a teleprompter all night long, every night, So you get to build this connection. And, I think that these are very meaningful conversations. I'm absolutely, thrilled that you're having so many of them. I follow you, I subscribe over there, and, you're prolific. You put a lot of content out, and that's great. And, so let's wrap it up here. Where can people, obviously connect with you? So obviously your YouTube channel, we link that down below, but I know you have some other platforms, right? You're streaming on Odyssey now, or tell us about that.
I have all of my short content is mirrored on Odyssey. I would love if people watched over there. I think Odyssey is the sort of disruptive video platform to watch. And they're really good to creators. So I'm over on Odyssey. I am also on Locals, rekietalaw.locals.com. And that's a place where you can get direct interaction. I know you're on there too, because I saw your face on that call.
Yeah, it was a great call. And I love that you're over there, because I think it's a great, that call was awesome. I thought, I think they're really sinking a lot of time into people, into the creators, and there are a lot of amazing people in that group. So I'm very excited about the direction that's going.
Yeah, so you can find me over there. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me being a complete jerk to people on Twitter. Look, the thing that I fell in love with the internet years and years and years ago was you can just go on there, you can be who you are, and that's what you see is what you get. And we're moving so far away from that with all of the moderation and with everything. And it's like I try and hold on to as much as I can. So I try and be unfiltered and irreverent because that's who I am in real life too. So if you like that stuff, come follow me somewhere.
Yeah, and it is good stuff. And I will tell you this: it is impressive to sort of watch you work. You know, you are you're very much authentically you. You know, and even on Twitter, I watch you out there, man. You get out there and you start throwing elbows on there, and it's good. You know, it's good. You're out there engaging, and I really admire it, because I think we need more people doing that, because right now there's a lot of activity on one side, and we're seeing what the consequences of that are. Right, they've captured Facebook, they've captured Twitter, they've captured a lot of these other platforms, and until people start to get a little bit sick of it and support other people who are, out there screaming from the rooftops like you're doing, uh it's going to continue to be a fight. So yep. So Nick Rekieta, so I really appreciate you coming on the show, my friend. I had a good time.
Yeah, man. And I'm going to have to get you on mine and we'll have a late night whiskey session. Really just throw it back.
Love to do it. Love to do it. We'll connect offline, and I'm going to send people over to your platform over at YouTube and over on Locals. We're on Locals too. So and if you're already on our Locals, just go and find Nick as well. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Nick. You have a good rest of your night, and we'll connect again.
Thanks, man. It was great to meet you and great to be on the show. Peace.
Yeah, you too. All right, everybody. So that was Nick Rekieta Law. That was fun. That was a good conversation. I really appreciate the work that he's doing, and I love his sort of authenticity about it. Very deep thinker, and I liked his answer on the idea about the laws. Sort of rolling back some of the laws that we have, because I've made this point on this channel a lot, saying that when you wake up and drive to the office, you break 5 or 6 laws every day. Everybody sort of likes to dogpile on the back of somebody who's a criminal, but our society is so overly criminalized that you're breaking the law at every turn. Every time you turn around, you've broken some law. And so what Mr. Rekieta was saying, of course, was let's roll some of those back. Maybe not having your license plate light on shouldn't result in a traffic stop. Just a thought. All right. So good stuff. So go check out his platform over on Locals.